At 90, Julie Andrews finally speaks the truth Hollywood never wanted to hear. She gave the world some of the most beloved voices in film history. Mary Poppins, Maria Von Trapp, the woman who taught a generation to believe a spoonful of sugar could fix almost anything. But the voice that defined Julie Andrews was taken from her in an operating room, and for decades she carried that loss quietly, alongside a marriage, a career, and a private life far more complicated than the wholesome image Hollywood built around her. Now, at 90, looking back across 70 years in the spotlight, Andrews has spoken with striking candor about the surgery that silenced her, the depression that followed, and the husband whose own darkness she loved in spite of everything. This is the real story, not the polished postcard, but the woman behind it. A voice discovered in wartime England. Julie Andrews was born Julia Elizabeth Wells on October 1, 1935, in Walton-on-Thames, England. Her mother, Barbara, was a pianist, and her father, Ted Wells, was a schoolteacher, a quiet, steady man who gave Julie a childhood grounded in books and simple pleasures. But the marriage did not survive the pressures of the Second World War, and when Julie was still young, her mother remarried a Canadian vaudeville performer named Ted Andrews. It was Ted who changed the course of her life. He and Barbara toured wartime England performing for soldiers and weary civilians, and it was in those smoky halls and battered theaters that a young Julie first watched what a voice could do to a room full of frightened people. Ted noticed something in his stepdaughter almost immediately. She had an extraordinary vocal range and a purity of pitch that seasoned musicians found startling in a child. He became her earliest teacher, and Julie began formal training soon after, eventually studying under a respected vocal coach who drilled her in the discipline of professional singing. The idea, as Andrews would later describe it, that an amateur practices until she gets something right, while a professional practices until she cannot get it wrong. That lesson would define her entire career. By 12, she was already a working performer. At 13, she sang for the royal family at the London Palladium, the youngest solo performer ever invited to the Royal Variety performance. Britain began calling her its youngest prima donna. She built a career on English variety stages through her teenage years, and by 19, she had crossed the Atlantic, making her Broadway debut in The Boy Friend in 1954. 2 years later, she originated the role of Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady, a performance that ran for years and made her one of the most sought-after voices on the American stage. Passed over, then vindicated. When Warner Brothers adapted My Fair Lady for film in the early 1960s, studio executives decided the role Andrews had made famous on Broadway needed a bigger movie star, and the part went to Audrey Hepburn instead. It was a public snub and a painful one. But Walt Disney had been watching Andrews on Broadway, and he saw exactly what Warner Brothers had dismissed. He cast her in the title role of Mary Poppins, and when the film premiered in the summer of 1964, it became a sensation, eventually earning her the Academy Award for Best Actress. The following year, she starred in The Sound of Music, which became one of the highest-grossing films ever made and cemented her as the biggest star in Hollywood musicals. The irony was not lost on anyone. The actress passed over for not being famous enough had, within a year, become more famous than the film that rejected her. Andrews spent the rest of the 1960s trying to prove she was more than a singing governess. She took dramatic roles, worked with Alfred Hitchcock on the spy thriller Torn Curtain, and pushed against the wholesome image the studios kept handing her. Some of those efforts succeeded. Others, like the expensive 1968 flop Star, did not. By the end of the decade, the era of the big-budget movie musical was fading, and Andrews found herself searching for a second act. Reinvention on her own terms. In the early 1970s, Andrews took a swing with the Julie Andrews Hour, a variety series that showcased her comic timing and range far beyond singing. Critics loved it, and it went on to win 7 Emmy Awards. But it struggled in the ratings against tougher competition, and ABC canceled it after a single season, a strange case of a show winning big at the Emmys only after it had already been pulled from the air. Rather than retreat, Andrews leaned further into risk. She began performing in nightclubs, an unlikely setting for a performer known as Hollywood's most wholesome leading lady, singing jazz standards and cracking jokes about her own prim image. It was a deliberate act of reinvention, and by the end of the decade it paid off in an unexpected way. In 1979, she starred in 10, directed by her husband Blake Edwards, a romantic comedy that became a major box office hit and reintroduced her to a mainstream audience as something other than a Disney fixture. She followed that with 2 roles that upended everything the public thought they knew about her. In 1981's S.O.B., a dark satire of the film industry, she appeared topless on screen, a moment that stunned audiences who had spent nearly 2 decades thinking of her as untouchably wholesome. A year later came Victor/Victoria, in which she played a struggling singer who reinvents herself as a female impersonator to find work, a role that earned her a Golden Globe and an Academy Award nomination, and one she is often called among the most creatively satisfying of her career. Both films were directed by Edwards, and both were, in their own way, statements. Andrews was not interested in staying inside the box the industry had built for her. The marriage everyone watched and few understood before Blake Edwards. There was Tony Walton, a set and costume designer Andrews married in 1959. Walton designed the costumes for Mary Poppins, and the couple had a daughter, Emma, in 1962. But the demands of Andrews's career, constant. Travel between Broadway and Hollywood, put a growing strain on the marriage, and the two divorced in 1967. She met Blake Edwards not long after, in circumstances both later described as almost comically appropriate, outside the office of a therapist they happened to share. Both had come out of failed marriages, and despite a 13-year age gap, they married in 1969. Their household eventually included Edwards's children from his previous marriage, along with 2 daughters, Amy and Joanna, whom the couple adopted from Vietnam in the 1970s. Over the following decades, Andrews and Edwards collaborated on 7 films together, from 10 to SOB to Victor/Victoria, and their marriage lasted 41 years, until Edwards' death in 2010. In later interviews, Andrews has spoken with unusual openness about the harder side of that marriage. Edwards, she has said, was extraordinarily funny, hilariously funny, in her words, but he also carried a genuine, recurring depression, something she witnessed up close for 4 decades. She has described him as someone who wrote more and more autobiographically as their years together went on, channeling his own struggles into the films they made. It was not the picture of an effortless Hollywood romance. It was a long marriage between 2 people who each carried real weight, and who chose again and again to carry it together. The surgery that took her voice. The event that reshaped the second half of Andrews' life began quietly, during her run in the Broadway revival of Victor/Victoria in the mid-1990s. She began noticing strain and hoarseness in her voice, and doctors eventually identified an issue on her vocal cords. Reports at the time described it variously as nodules or a polyp, though Andrews later clarified the problem was closer to a small cyst caused by prolonged vocal strain. Her doctors offer her a surgical fix, describing it as a low-risk procedure that would let her return to singing within weeks. The surgery took place in June 1997 at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. It did not go as promised. Instead of resolving the issue, the operation left her vocal cords permanently scarred, robbing them of the flexibility needed to vibrate and produce a controlled singing tone. Her speaking voice was reduced to a rasp for a time, and the 4-octave singing voice that had carried her through My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins, and The Sound of Music was gone. In late 1998, Blake Edwards told the press plainly that he did not believe his wife would ever sing again, calling it an absolute tragedy, a statement Andrews found painfully premature and something of an invasion of her privacy at the time. But months later, in a February 1999 interview with Barbara Walters on 2020, Andrews confirmed the truth herself. Doctors held out little hope for her voice's recovery. She told Walters that not being able to sing with an orchestra, to phrase a lyric, or give an audience that particular kind of joy would leave her devastated. In December 1999, she filed a malpractice lawsuit against her surgeons and the hospital, arguing she had never been properly warned of the risks. The case was settled privately in 2000, but no settlement could restore what the surgery had taken. Grief and what came after it. Andrews has since spoken candidly about the psychological toll of that loss. In a later interview with AARP, she described entering a real depression in the aftermath, not simply disappointment, but a genuine period of mourning for a part of her identity she had built since childhood. Singing had been the thread running through her entire life, from performing for the royal family as a teenager to originating Eliza Doolittle on Broadway. Losing it was not a career setback, it was closer to a bereavement. What pulled her through, by her own account, was an unexpected new outlet. Around the same period, her daughter Emma asked her to collaborate on a series of children's books, and the two began writing together. Andrews has described it as a stroke of good fortune that arrived exactly when she needed it, a brand new creative path that opened in her mid-60s, when most people might assume a performer's most productive years were behind her. She has said plainly that she still misses singing and always will. But she has also said she would have been a far sadder woman without something to hold on to in its place, and writing became that something. That resilience carried into her final years with Edwards as well. As his health declined in the years before his death in 2010, Andrews stayed close to him, drawing on the same steadiness that had defined their 41 years together. She has spoken since about how his humor and his darkness were two sides of the same man, and how loving him meant holding space for both. When he died, she lost not just a husband but a creative partner who had helped engineer some of the boldest reinventions of her career, the films that let Mary Poppins take her clothes off, play a man playing a woman, and prove there was far more to her than a spoonful of sugar. A legacy still being written. At 90, Julie Andrews is no longer chasing reinvention. She has already lived through several. The girl who sang for a king at 13, the ingenue passed over for Audrey Hepburn, the Oscar winner, the topless provocateur of SOB, the woman who lost her singing voice and found a writer's voice instead. All of it belongs to the same life, carried by the same quiet determination her old singing teacher once tried to instill in her: work until you cannot go wrong. She has outlived the husband whose depression she came to understand better than almost anyone, and she has outlived the version of her own voice that made her famous in the first place. What remains is a woman who has been remarkably honest in her own time and on her own terms about both of those losses, not through some dramatic new tell-all, but through the steady accumulation of interviews and memoirs across 2 decades, each one adding a little more truth to the record. That may be the most Julie Andrews thing of all. Not a shocking confession, but a lifetime spent quietly telling the truth, a little at a time, to anyone willing to listen. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives behind the legends. And stick around, the next story might surprise you even more.